Hey guys, welcome back to Vinceville Customs, and today we're going to continue our sponsored work in progress series from Garage Kits US Colors, and this is the Hariqa Fire Elemental Kit from the Denizens of Zao series. So in this video what we're going to do is we're going to focus on doing a black latex dress at the bottom. The top of the dress is going to be like a red leathery look. The jewelry is going to be all silver, and the hair is going to be like a dirty blonde. So what I want to do is I want to go over in this video basically masking with Silly Putty, how I come up with the latex shiny dress, how I go about just doing everything. So what I'm going to do is we're going to get a little bit close onto the paints I'll be using to do my line work and explain what I'm doing. After that we're going to dive into how I do masking with the Silly Putty, and then after that we're just going to go in and start painting her up and get her finished up. Okay, so we're going to get ready to start masking our item. And masking is a little bit tricky, and I kind of try to go over some tips and tricks on how I go about masking my item. The way I build my kit is I think of it as a steps going up the stairs. Your bottom layer, at the very bottom layer is your skin, especially on this item. Then basically after your skin you have the outfit on the character. And then after that you have your jewelry. And then at the very top you have your hair. Because I find it's easier, do your skin tone first, because that's always usually at the bottom layer. The outfit's usually the next layer, so you paint that up. And then the next layer after that is the hair. I find that if you were to paint this outfit first and then you want to mask off everything and do the skin, you're basically masking this area and then you're masking something like that area to go down. Whereas the skin is just going around in one area, and you just put your masking stuff here and then you paint your item. It's just easier, and you'll kind of see how we progress as we go. Now, I don't like to use masking tape or modeler's tape. I find it just, sometimes you could do a really beautiful paint up, but that stuff, if you're not careful, you might rip your paint off, or you might rip a detail off or something. I've always had bad experiences, so I like to use Silly Putty. We'll get a little bit deeper into the Silly Putty later when we're ready to start masking, but as you can see, the Silly Putty is a little bit close to this skin paint up. And the problem is when you're ready to start putting on Silly Putty, is you might start to see, like, after you paint up the black outfit and you pull off the Silly Putty, you might have realized that, oh, I didn't go all the way to the edge and we have a little bit of a black coming around the leg, or I went too far over the outfit and then you have a little bit of a skin paint showing over there and it's a mess up. So I like to do trim work first for the Silly Putty masking. And as you can see here, we have some paint brushes and some thicker paints. Airbrush ready paint will work for your masking, but I find it's too watery because it's made for your airbrush. And sometimes what will happen is, if you use some of this onto an area like that, you might get some bleeding, or maybe you put too much paint on by accident and it just starts to run on you and it becomes a nightmare. So I find that using some thicker paints are going to be good just for the masking line. So as you can see, I have different brands of paint that are a little bit thicker. They're like, I guess you could say it's a little bit like milky-ish type of paint up. It doesn't really go through the airbrush very well. You would have to water them down. But they're not like, tube paints where it's something that's squeezing out of a tube like this, So it's more of a milky-ish type of a paint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my black line work at the bottom here, because the bottom of her is black latex. So all I have to do is sit here and just do a line going around, really nice and clean. That gives me basically a guide of where to put the Silly Putty. Once we do the bottom part and then we do the top part, I'm going to do the same exact thing. I'm going to do basically the red area around there, and then I'm going to mask it off with Silly Putty and paint red. Once the outfit's done, then I'm going to start doing all the jewelry. But you can see the arms will be a little bit easier because I could pop them off the statue. I could do a little bit of trim with silver, and then I can mask off that area with Silly Putty, and I could paint the jewelry. And once the outfit's done, the jewelry's done, the hair is last, because that goes over everything. You can pretty much see it up here. It pretty much covers the outfit and the jewelry, so I find it would be easier to do like a yellowish, brownish trim going around the hair, mask off everything with Silly Putty, and then just focus on the hair. So that's pretty much my process. It's very tedious work. You can sit there and you can mask an item basically for 30 minutes, an hour, maybe 2 hours. And literally, when you go to paint it, you can paint it in like 20 seconds or a minute. That's where a lot of the paint work comes from, is masking. Painting itself from like the airbrush, it could take like fast. It goes very fast if you know what you're doing and you know how to do the textures and you know how to blend. It goes very fast. but the masking is what takes forever. Whether you're using tape or Silly Putty, it just takes a long time. So that's pretty much the, you know, hardest part, I would say, of painting is the masking. Now, what I'll do is I'll set up on the desk. I'm going to sit down. You'll see how I do all the trim work. And then when we're ready, I'm going to start going over the Silly Putty. And then once you get an idea of how, you know, I do this outfit and I do my masking, we're just going to run through the rest of the item of just painting it up and getting it done. Okay, so as you see, I did the black line all around the legs. It doesn't really matter that it's messy in this direction. It's just long as that nice clean line is going around the leg area for masking. Now, if you do a little bit of, you know, so maybe a little bit of a hairline mark, or you did a little bit of bleeding and you need to clean it up, I have these micro applicators. Get these off of like eBay and stuff like that. They come in different sizes, and they're used for like makeup, but you can use them for a hobby as well. And usually what I do is I just put a little bit of like saliva on it, and I kind of go into the area and I wipe it out and I push it out. And then even if I take out that black line I did, I could go back in again with another black line and clean it up. So that's why I did the whole car paint layer on top of the skin tone, because now if we didn't do the car paint and then flatten it and give it like, you know, you have your skin tone layer of paint, then you have your car paint layer, and then you have your next layer of the flat top coat. Now, if we didn't do the car paint and the flat top coat, what happens is that black paint would seep into the skin tone. And then if you go to wipe that off, what happens is you're not really wiping off the black paint. What you're doing is you're wiping off the black paint and the skin tone, and you're getting down to the primer, so then you mess everything up. So now, any of this black that gets on there, what it is I'm going to be wiping the flat coat off, and then the car paint that's there is protecting it, and you just wipe off that black. So it helps give you a layer of protection and clean up your edges. That's why I go that route with doing it. So as of right now, we're looking pretty good. What I'm going to probably do is do a little bit up here, over here. This is going to be red. So I think for now what I'll do is, I'll do my red trim around here and get it out of the way. What'll happen over here is this red will kind of disappear a little bit. I might have to do another layer down the line, only because this top part is going to turn red around there. But usually what I do is I let this dry out for a little while. I really don't try and rush it. Just try and, you know, get everything nice and clean, let it sit. Make sure, because like if there's any areas like in here where I had to put extra paint to try to get into crevices, it's still wet in there, and I don't want to put my Silly Putty on it now, and then all of a sudden when I pull the Silly Putty off, all that black paint in there just spread underneath the Silly Putty. So make sure all your line work is dry, and make sure you look at all different directions, because a little spot over here I have to clean up and go around. Maybe there's a spot over there I need to get. You know, you just keep looking at all your areas and make sure you get everything. Underneath here is going to be the tricky part, getting everything in there, but it should work out pretty well. So I'll fix up those two areas. I'll have the red already done by the time we come back, and then we're going to go over the masking and what I usually use. Okay, we're going to get ready to start masking up the statue so we can paint the dress. Now, to mask up the skin tone, I like to use Silly Putty and Saran Wrap to mask all my stuff on all my statues. Now, some people, they like masking tape or they like modeler's tape. Personally, I stay away from tape. I've had way too many bad experiences with it. And when I discovered Silly Putty, it changed my life for painting, and it makes life a lot easier. It just takes a little bit of time to mask, but at the end of the day, I find it's easier. Plus, you get to use it over and over and over again. So as you can see, we have 3 tubs right here of Silly Putty, and then we have, which is the 5-pound brick is what I get. Now, if you're new to the hobby and you're not sure if you want to use masking tape, modeler's tape, or Silly Putty, you can go to a toy store or something and you can find one of those little red eggs that have Silly Putty in it. You want to get the original Silly Putty, that's the pink, and you can test it out. The only problem is, if you're going to buy like a bunch of eggs to mask your statue, you're going to spend crazy amounts of money. If you go to the Crayola store, you can buy yourself a 5-pound brick of Silly Putty, as you can see in here. and this will last you for years. Literally, I think after all the stuff I do all year long, I probably go through a 5-pound brick maybe once every 3 or 4 years, and I use a lot. Now, if you're new to the hobby and you want to get some Silly Putty but you're not going to use a lot, maybe you can find somebody else at like a hobby show and you can say, hey, you guys want to go in on a 5-pound brick, because a 5-pound brick is usually around like $100 on the Crayola store. So I just want to give you guys some of that info as of now. And you can use Silly Putty over and over and over when you paint, but what I like to do is, this is kind of like my fresh batch of Silly Putty where I'll use it on like cleaner stuff, maybe like skin tones, or maybe some paint applications where I feel that if I use the dirty Silly Putty on it, maybe those paint apps might pull the particles out of the Silly Putty and get stuck. So you have super fresh stuff in the box that I use whenever I need something specific. Then we have the semi-clean, and then we have the semi-dirty, which is kind of like, it's dirty, it could go over certain things I know it can, and certain things it can't. But then we have the really dirty stuff where literally if I use this stuff and I feel it's just really bad, I'll throw it away. I do know some people in the hobby that use the same batch of Silly Putty over and over and over, and they've used it for years and it's non-stop. I'm just kind of like picky where I like to have clean stuff on certain paint apps, and I'll use the dirtier stuff on other apps. And then if there's something really, really dirty, I'll use this stuff. Like say, if I have to prime up an area, I don't really want to get any of that like primer or any of that heavy enamel stuff into like my clean batches. This is what I do. So that's pretty much that. Now, saran wrap, you go to your basic, any store, you get yourself saran wrap, and you can use this to mask up your statue. We'll kind of go over that a little bit later. I use saran wrap a lot on my stuff. The only thing with saran wrap is certain paint apps you can't use the saran wrap, because if you put it too tight and you put it on your item, when you go to rip it off, you'll rip the paint too. So saran wrap's a little bit more tricky, but that's why it's good to have a lot of Silly Putty, because this way if you want to throw a lot of Silly Putty over the item, you can, and it comes off with ease. Now, as far as tools, I use these two dentist tools here for doing my masking, which means is when you go put your item on the statue and you need to kind of make a nice clean line, I have these dentist tools. We'll get in a little bit closer in a second on them, and I'll also give you a number on the tool if you want to pick one up. The reason why I came about this is I know some people, they might use X-Acto blades, other people might use toothpicks. I found that when I went to the dentist years back, I asked the dentist, I said, hey, you got any old dentist tools you're not using anymore? I do sculpting and stuff. I'm willing to buy some of your old ones, anything that's broken, damaged, whatever. So a dentist went into his back and he gave me brand new tools that he didn't want these anymore. He didn't like them, and he gave me these two tools here, and I've had these probably for like almost 10 years or more now. So I got a little bit scared with this dentist tool, because I go use this for almost everything. It's like one of those tools where it's like your golden tool and you use it all the time. So I went to another dentist maybe a year ago, and I found out in their book the number of the tool, so I picked up 2 more of them. They're very expensive though. If you want to buy brand new dentist tools, they could run anywhere from like $28 to like $30 or so, or even more. So if you're going to be using them, you got to understand that if you're going to use them for sculpting with Aves, they're going to get caked up. So if you have like a crappy tool you want to get off of eBay, that's great. But what happens is, you can see, they sort of get really caked up and they get dirty. So if you're going to drop like 30 or so more dollars on a masking tool, you're not really going to want to use it for sculpting this much. But you go on eBay and you can get really super cheap stuff like these, which is fine as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a little bit closer on these tools. I'll give you the number. What we'll do is I'll show you guys how I start masking up the item while using these tools, and then we go from there. Okay, so let's go over the tools that I use for masking the Silly Putty. So this one right here is my go-to tool for everything. I use this for almost all my mask work, and sometimes I'll use it for sculpting, but I clean it out right away. After 10 years, you can see it's really dirty, but it would be a lot worse if I didn't take care of it. So you can see on the edge, it's not a very sharp tool. The tip of it is very rounded too, so it's really good for masking, where it's not going to like grab your paint and scratch it. It's not going to cut anything. So if you use like an X-Acto blade or a toothpick, you got to get a different feel. So this thing right here, like I say, these things cost like anywhere from like $30 to $40. But the cool thing about it is, if you bend it this way or you turn it this way, you can pull, you can push, and you can use this to get into crevices. So the idea of having 2 different ways of this is bent, it's a really great tool to get and use. So this is my go-to for everything. Like I said, I have some backups right here. We'll get a little bit closer in a second, so if you guys want to look one up, you can. But I'm pretty sure a lot of people have their own types of tools out there, but whatever works for you works for you. So this one right here too was given to me, and this one right here, it's got this rounded edge and it's flat. So this one's really good for like pushing into like a crevice if I have to kind of get some like extra silly putty into a crevice, and then I can use my other tool to fine line it. But this one's really good because, like I say, it's a little bit wider and it's got rounded edges and it won't scrape anything. The other end is kind of useless. I use that for sculpting whenever, but this is what I use there. Now, we're getting a little bit closer here so you can actually see if you want to pick one up. Like I said, these things are pretty expensive, but you get what you pay for if you go to the dentist and you find these really cool tools. Now, there's a lot of sculptors out there that might make their own tools for masking and sculpting, which is fine. It's just something that was given to me and it just made my life a lot easier. You could go on eBay and you can actually pick up cheaper tools, which are like $5 for a couple of them, but you get what you pay for. They will bend on you sometimes. They're really thick and clunky and heavy. You could go on eBay and you can find some really cool dentist tools. Like I've found some in the past that were fairly cheap, but over time they got all caked up. As you can see, like these right here, sort of like the same exact thing I just showed you, but they're all caked up and they're used. But I mean, if you use A's on them after a while and you want to kind of like, you know, bring them back to life, you can use an X-Acto blade and you can kind of like scrape it off and you can bring your tool back to life a little bit more. But I mean, these right here, if you go on eBay and you find these might be around anywhere like the $15 to $20 range, stuff like that. So, those are my tools. Basically, you know, it's just Silly Putty, Saran Wrap, and masking, and that's pretty much it. That's all I use. Silly Putty's fairly easy. I'll just show you guys right now. If you warm it up, like when you first pull it out, if it's a cold day, it's going to be hard to move. But if you get it in your hand and you mush it around, you get it warm, you can just stretch it around the item. So real quick, I'll show you a little example. Like say this statue right here, you wanted to mask off the hair. What you do is you kind of just put the Silly Putty around the area. You know, it's kind of like almost like sculpting. And then you take your tool and you kind of start pushing the stuff, but you don't scrape your paint. You just kind of start pushing your tool around like so. And you just keep playing with it until you get everything masked off. So you could kind of just keep going like so. And you do like a masking, see? Something like that. So it's just on a bigger scale when we're ready to do the statue. So what we'll do is we're going to get set up. We're going to show you how to mask it all off. We'll get the legs all masked off. We'll get some of the upper body masked off. And then we'll wrap Saran Wrap around the top of it. We'll paint the dress, pop that off, and then we just keep doing the same process over and over again until she's done. Okay, we're going to start our masking with the Silly Putty. So what I do is just grab some Silly Putty from my container. This is the cleaner version, and this will be fine for what I'm doing. So you don't want to like just stack like, you know, thick stuff on your item like that. You want to actually kind of spread it out and thin it. Get it warmed up between your fingers, you know, like so. And then what you could do is you can lay it on like that, and then you can start pushing it around the area. So the other thing too is think about how it's going to work. So this leg is a little bit deeper than this leg. This leg sticks out. So I'll do this leg first, and then I'll do this one, because if I do this one and then I try to get in here, I mess up that. So just also keep that in mind as well. So normally what I do is if I really want to take my time masking, just stretch it out. You know, you stretch it out like so, however you want to do it. Now this is kind of like to a point there, so you could kind of set this up to a point, and then you just place it on. Now what you want to do is, if it gets warm, it gets very soft, you can start spreading it. But the other thing too is you want to be careful. You don't want to like scratch your paint when you're spreading it. So just kind of like push it, let it go to where it goes, and like so. Now it's covering that black line, so that's where your tool comes into effect. Now sometimes you can't just like push it, because then it pulls it up. So you want to use like your finger like so, and sort of just start pushing it around the area. Don't scrape, don't press hard, just go nice and soft. Let the tool sort of push it. And then you kind of just push it in there with your fingers, like so. So as you start to do it, you'll see that little black line there where you're doing the Silly Putty. So you just got to keep going around your area. And now if you're running into a problem where you're like, oh man, you know, every time I push this stuff it's too thick, or so you got to thin it out. So try not to throw too much Silly Putty on your item. Keep it thin and go from there. Now what you might have to do is, like, after you put this on, like after we get our first layer on and we go throughout the whole item, always double check your item before you go to paint, because when you're doing this side, might not be paying attention and you might like rub this off by accident. And then when you go to paint, you might hit it and you hit some skin like that. So always be, wary of what you're doing and how you're putting it on. So some areas in here, without trying to get into the tool, I got the thicker tool and I'll squeeze this in to those areas like that. So always make sure you're not scraping your paint, you're not digging into anything and going from there. And that's pretty much masking for now. So as you can see, the Silly Putty stays on very well. It's not going to come off. As long as you get it heated up with your hands, it sticks pretty well. If you have a big item and it's really a lot of Silly Putty, what will happen is if you're like studio or you're working in your house, it's very hot, the Silly Putty, if it's on the item, will start to sort of sag and come off the item. So this is good for short term, like, okay, I'm doing this up, it's going to take me like 20 minutes to mask this, then I paint my item and I get it all done, and then I pull the Silly Putty off. If you leave the Silly Putty on overnight, what will happen is it probably will start to sag down and go, because it's not really like, it's Silly Putty, it's soft. It just kind of goes to where it goes. So that's also something to think about when you're working. Now another thing to think about is if you put it on thin, right? Like say you put this on thin, like really thin, like a really thin layer, right? And you start pushing it, be careful if you spread it, because if you spread it too much, you might run into issues like that where you kind of sort of see like the skin or the paint underneath see through. So you got to keep it at a certain thickness and make sure it covers everything. But like I said, I'm going to just sit here. I'm going to do this for like 20 minutes. Once this is done, we'll come back and we'll look at it and it'll give you a better idea on how I set it up. And like I said, you always double check. Whenever you pick up your item, if you go to paint it, like say you move it or you go do some other stuff, you come back, always check what you're doing, because you can ruin this and mess up your line work. But it's just tedious work. It's not like a lot of fun, but like you usually just kick on a movie, some music, and just sit there and take your time doing it. So I'm going to go through it now, get it all cleaned up, get it all messed up, and then what we'll do is when we come back, I'll show you how I do the top part with some saran wrap. We'll talk about the saran wrap a little bit more, and then after that we can start painting up the dress. Okay, so she's all masked off now where I need it to be, and I went in a little bit off camera just so I had to get in a little bit closer and fix up some areas there. So we're pretty much masked off, and you can see the reason why we did all that black line was because now we know where all the masking goes. So you just want to make sure everything is looking pretty good. Now, the top part, all I did was some basic Silly Putty up there. I didn't make it look perfect only because we don't have to worry about too much up here. So all you do right now is you take your saran wrap, which actually saves you time. Instead of like, masking everything off with Silly Putty, you can just go like this. So you take your saran wrap, you go around your area, and you wrap it around. Now you don't have to do it like skin tight and like really press this stuff on. Just enough so it covers up the item. So it saves on time of Silly Putty work, and it still covers what you need to cover. And that's a good thing about the saran wrap. You just have to make sure that you get it into all the areas. Now, if you go too loose, though, and you spray, what'll happen is it'll flop out, though, and then you'll get spray underneath of it. So that's one thing you got to keep in mind. So don't be afraid to, like, rip off a couple thinner strands like so, and kind of, like, go underneath an area like the hair, and kind of pull it up and go around like that. And that's a good thing about saran wrap. It's a time saver. It works very well with trying to get into areas like this where you don't really need to worry about paint, and instead of sitting there masking. Now, you always have to be careful with your saran wrap, though, because if you're not careful, you can pull up the Silly Putty while you're doing it, and or you could go over an area that you're spraying, and then when you pull off the saran wrap, you realize that you went over too far because it is clear. So sometimes, like, if you were going to be spraying over here, there's a little bit of saran wrap kind of covering it. So, but we don't have to worry about it because this is like over here is where we're painting all the black. We're not really worried about this much up here. So you can see there is some Silly Putty hanging off the side, but the saran wrap is covering all of the rest of the item. So that makes life a lot easier with that. Now, as far as saran wrap goes, there is a couple problems with it. If you're painting something that's got like candy coat, like say you spray like chrome silver and then you do Tamiya clear red on it, for like an example. So if you do chrome silver on your item and then you do like a clear candy coat over it, whether it's like Tamiya, Spaztec, or something else, what happens is that creates sort of like like a soft kind of covering. So if you put saran wrap on it and you wrap it around and you leave it for like a couple hours, when you pull that saran wrap off, two things will happen. One, you'll rip all the paint off with it, or two, you'll leave markings on it. So you got to kind of understand that saran wrap is good for certain things and certain things it's not good for. So you have to kind of get a little bit experience with it. You could paint up something really beautiful and then you need to do this little area and you wrap saran wrap around it. And you paint that little area, then when you pull off all your masking, you realize the saran wrap is ripping stuff off. So certain paints, it will, like the skin tone and the way I painted up the skin tone, it's not going to rip any of that off. We're fine. But specific paints like these, like, these candy coats, always sort of like react to it and rip it off. I've tried some enamels like car paints, like cans, like Duplicolor car paints and stuff like that, like, just regular reds and blues and stuff. It gets very tacky to the car paint, but I've never really had it rip off though, but it gets very scary when you're trying to do it. So if you're not very comfortable with saran wrapping, you don't have enough experience, you can just go right ahead and mask the whole thing if you want with Silly Putty, if you want to go that route. There is some other stuff though too. If you have foam, like I use this foam stuff for packing my statues. You get this stuff off of eBay, like it's like I forget how thin the stuff is, but it's packing foam. So say there's an area you're a little bit concerned about with the saran wrap. What you could do is you could pull off the saran wrap like this. You can wrap it around this foam stuff, and then you can wrap it like this, and you can cover it. And this way, you're not worried about the saran wrap ripping off a certain part of your statue. So that's another thing you can think about doing. But yeah, I suggest you get some of this packing foam if you're doing statues and you ever have to ship stuff out, or you want to move it or protect it. It's good for stuff, and I use it on my desk too when I'm doing some statues. I don't want to get anything dirty. It's kind of like a little bit soft to it, so it kind of works out. So that's saran wrap. Like I said, it's really great. I mean, you can go pick up a box of this stuff and use it for all your stuff. It's really good for like if you're working on a statue and you painted up the base, but you don't want to get the base all dirty, you can wrap it up in some foam, and then you can wrap saran wrap around it, and then you can put your item on the base if you want to. So that's kind of where we're at with this. One other thing too is, like this little example right here. Okay, so as you kind of see right over here, right, this little part right over here, that's kind of not. Alright, so I put the Silly Putty here and I put the saran wrap here. If you're not careful and you only put the Silly Putty here and you wrap around saran wrap, you might show a little piece of skin. So always be wary of where you're masking to. Just be on the safe side. Make sure you're always hitting every corner and you're always looking over your item before paint goes. So, but now that she's pretty much ready for paint, we're going to start working on the dress. Okay, so we're all masked up as you can see, and we're ready to go and start painting up the dress. Now, as I was working on the masking, I realized that the inside of the dress has some line work, so I decided as I'm masking her up, what's going to happen is I'm going to paint the inside of the dress kind of like a reddish velvet look, just kind of like very light red, nothing too potent. I want it to be more of like a flat black, or maybe look a little silky in the inside. Because if you have this whole dress latex and it comes latex in the inside, you really don't break it up and like bring the dress out a little bit more than what it is. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit the inside now with some jet black, some true red, some pearl black, and sort of just give the inside a little bit of a look. Now, usually when you do that, sometimes you want to seal it up or make it secured before you start masking again, because I figure once that's dried, I could go back in and mask those areas, and then I could paint up the latex dress. If you use Tester's Dull Coat out of a can and you spray anything that's got Silly Putty on, you gotta let that dry for a while, because this stuff reacts to Silly Putty and it melts it. It's not going to destroy your Silly Putty if you spray a lot where it's bleeding, but if you just mist it on there, what happens is the Silly Putty breaks down and gets very tacky and it will ruin your paint. But after it dries a while, the Silly Putty kind of goes back to normal. But it's just one of those things that you got to be kind of careful of if you use Tester's Dull Coat. So at this point, I probably won't use it anymore while using the Silly Putty. So once we get the inside of the dress pretty much the flat look like I'm going for, what I'll do is I'll probably hit it with the blow dryer, dry it up, maybe hit it with some of the Garage Kids flat top coat, which is over here. So I'll put some Garage Kids flat top coat on it. We'll get it to, you know, pretty much be a little bit dull looking, and it'll be a little bit secured and ready for Silly Putty once it's dry. You know, Silly Putty on the statue is not going to go bad. Working on it for like an hour or so or two, it's going to be fine. If you leave it on overnight, by the next day you will come back and it starts to sag down. Probably the knee part would come down, stuff like that. But working on it for like an hour or two here and there, you're fine. As far as the latex dress goes, I really haven't come across a way of, only the paints I've ever used that could get a really shiny latex look is Tamiya gunmetal here. So what I'll do is I'll paint the whole dress in a gunmetal. We'll use some jet black to do a little bit shading in areas. Maybe I'll go back in with a little bit of a dry brushing and maybe bring out some of the little details. We'll see how it looks once I get that on there. And then once that's dried, which I'll use a blow dryer to sort of dry it up, I'm going to go back into the garage and I'm going to use Duplicolor clear gloss on it. And I'm going to get a really shiny coat. What I'll have to do is I'll have to spray one coat, then I'll have to spray another coat, and get it really shiny, and then there you go, we're pretty much done with that. You can't really overspray it, and I've used other types of acrylic paints with the Duplicolor, and the problem is it breaks them up, it cracks, you get errors, you get all kinds of mess up. So the only color paint that I've come across that can give me that like latex metallically looking is the Tamiya paints. I've used the Garage Kids jet black just sort of like at shading areas, which is fine, but if you go too heavy with it, sometimes it cracks it up. Plus it has a lot to do with the weather too and stuff like that. So when we're ready to pretty much pull off the masking, we'll get in a little bit deeper with that. That's a little bit tricky only because spraying this Duplicolor over this and over the Silly Putty, what happens is you get a lot of really thick paint between the areas there, so you can't just rip off the Silly Putty because it cracks it. You sort of got to use an X-Acto knife and kind of go in there and break some of it up. But we'll get into that a little bit later. So for now, let's get the inside of the dress done. We'll mask it off, and then we'll come and we'll do the latex, and we'll gloss it up, and then at the end we'll talk about how we pull it apart. Alright, so we're all masked up and we're ready to go. Now, this Tamiya gunmetal stuff does not really go great through the airbrush out of the bottle. It's very, very thick. So what I do is I use a couple drops of their thinner and I thin it down and it goes through the airbrush no problem whatsoever after that. So that's kind of a thing to think about. Some of these other paints that are a little bit thicker, you might need thinners to take them down. You might need water to take them down. It all depends on what you use. But for this one, you definitely got to use some kind of a thinner. Otherwise, it will clog up your paintbrush or will come out very speckly. Thin it down enough, it comes out very smooth and it goes on really, really thick too, which is kind of good. Okay, so I pretty much did all the gunmetal on her. I mixed up a little extra chrome silver into the gunmetal. I did a little bit extra there. And then what I used is the jet black to sort of hit some shadow areas, like in between the wrinkles of the dress, some wrinkles going up in this direction, some in there. So that jet black will help pull it down. Now, what I'm doing is I'm doing a little bit of an experiment to see if I'm going to like it or not. I have some of this Liquitex Interference Blue, which I use for a lot of my stuff. I watered it down a lot, so it comes out very watery. So I'm just kind of hitting in some highlight areas, just to give it like a little bit of a pop and stuff. Just to give it a little bit of like a bluish tint, pearl. And I'm going to hit it on some of the higher wrinkles. You don't have to go too crazy with it, otherwise it'll start turning like whitish. But it'll help bring out these details in here without trying to force it with a paintbrush. Because once you gloss it up, the glossiness is going to really bring out all those little like sculpted details that Roberto did. I don't like trying to force too much of them. So this little bit of this interference is giving it like a reflective bluish tint. So if you ever like look at latex on Google and stuff, you'll see that that's in there. So this is kind of bringing it out in some, which is really starting to look cool now in person. It may not show up much in camera, but it really makes it pop a little bit more. And it gives the latex a little bit more life than just pure black and then the gloss. So let's just add a little bit more here and there. Try to bring out some of these wrinkles a little bit. Bottom of the dress too, I go a little bit heavier down here just to kind of make it a little bit more popping and different. Maybe it'll help break it up too when I do the base. Especially these areas here, which really makes it pop a little bit more. Storm outside, so sorry about that. So we're pretty much where I want it to be. So I'm going to let this kind of cure up for, I don't know, maybe about a good 20 minutes. I'm going to hit it with the hair dryer, and then we'll go into the garage and gloss coat it. Only because I definitely want to get a clear coat on this before the end of the night. So I at least got a little bit of time to let it cure up. But yeah, it's starting to pop a little bit more. Hopefully it's showing in the camera. Okay, so I was going into the garage ready to gloss coat this up, and the storm came up like crazy. There's flash flood warnings. The humidity is nuts out there. So I said, you know what? I'm going to have to gloss coat this here in the airbrush booth. Now, the fumes are really strong. Even though my booth takes a lot of these fumes out, it's the fumes coming off the item that's really potent right now. I'm very sensitive to lacquers and enamels. So this type of process is just very strong for me. That's why I like doing it in the garage. But well, I'm going to kick on the airbrush booth after I'm done explaining this, and I should be fine for like a few hours, and then I could come back and we could take off all the masking. But you can see by doing this process, we have a nice latex dress. It's really shiny. It really pops a lot more now. So if you looked at any like type of latex on Google and stuff, you can see how that sort of pops. Now I like the idea of not going crazy trying to bring out all this detail like with like silver or anything in the dress, because I don't feel it really needs it. I think by getting in closer you can see it and it pops in more, whereas trying to force it, it's kind of But I mean, I don't know, stuff might evolve as I go. Maybe when I pull off all the masking and I do up the rest of the item, maybe if I want to do any more details on it, I can, or if I feel like I want to try some different trim, I can. But we'll see how it goes and evolves. But for right now, the main dress is where I wanted it to be, so you can kind of see how it looks. It's really nice and shiny. Now, if I did this in the garage with the humidity, what would happen is you would spray that gloss on it, but what happens is it would start to cloud, though, especially over the black, and it will start to turn like grayish almost. So that's the problem with humidity and doing this type of like a clear coat on your item. But it came out pretty well. It went on smooth. Everything's looking good. So we're just going to let this pretty much dry up for like 2 hours, and we'll come back, we'll pull off all the masking. I could actually pull off the saran wrap now if I want to, but sometimes I'm like, okay, maybe let's just not push my luck, because sometimes if you pull off the saran wrap and you just kind of miss a piece and you grab your item and then you pull off the saran wrap while that's still wet, you ruin your statue. So sometimes it's best just to leave it alone, let it dry, do its thing, and then slowly pull off the masking later. But that's pretty good where we're at. Now the cool thing about adding that little interference blue, it's going to be like a complementary color for like the yellows and oranges, especially if you look at the color wheel. Like a bluish purple is kind of like the opposite of those colors, so it's like the complementary color. So it's kind of make it just stand out a little bit more. So it's not all pure red and orange throughout the whole statue. So there's just a little bit of a other color in there just for fun. So we'll let this dry up. I'll kick on the fan, get a little more of this fumes out there, and then hopefully maybe in like 2 hours, if I still have power, we can start pulling off the mask. Okay, so I pulled off the top part of this masking already. Fairly simple. The only problem with doing this thick stuff with the Silly Putty is, like I said, you create a shell because this is car paint. It's very thick. So there's kind of like a shell here. So if you try to pull this off, it starts crackling and causing issues. Like regular paint, like regular acrylics, so garage kit paints, if you paint something up there and you pull it off, you get a nice even pull. It doesn't really go. But if you have thicker paints like Tamiya paints, doing this type of car paint, maybe something like Createx where it's really thick, you have to kind of sort of split it in the area to kind of get a nice thing. Like even if you used masking tape and you pull it off, you'd still get some kind of cracking going. So it's just is what it is with this thick stuff. So what I have to do is sort of take my X-Acto blade and sort of help crackle it and take it, cut it when I do it. Sometimes it might come off very evenly, and sometimes it might come off very harsh where you get, if you spray too thick here, but you spray thin here. So it's just one of those things. So we're going to kind of try to get set up and start pulling this off. But the other thing too is I don't really want to lay it on its back too much because, you know, even though I painted it, it dried for about 3 hours now, I still just want to make sure that this cures well overnight. So I don't want to ruin any of that. So it's a matter of like, I got to kind of hold it like this and then sort of pull it down. So let's try to get a little bit closer. I'll show you how to kind of take it apart, and then from there I'll try to get the rest of it off. Alright, so let's try and do this part here. So like I said, if you try and pull this apart, it's almost like very, very thick. So if you just give a little bit of a cut, I'm not digging into the item, I'm just kind of running the blade along the very edge and kind of try to do it here as well. You know, you could kind of spread it apart if you have to. It will come apart. There may be a little flaking with using the thicker paint. You could kind of pull off those flakes later. It's not really the end of the world. But after painting this up, I decided maybe this trim that I'm pulling this apart from, I might actually do some red leather trim down the sides too. So we'll see how that works. So as you start to pull it off, you start getting a nice little even line going there. And like I said, you could kind of do this. You kind of pull it down and just pull it nice and slow. Like I said, if you start getting any of that flaking again, you might want to go in there again and sort of cut a little bit of it and just go along the edge. Now, like I said, if there is flaking, you use your fingernail and sort of pull it apart. But sometimes it's best to kind of let it dry, so then when you scrape it like the next day, it really flakes off a little bit easier. If you don't let this dry fast enough, you know, or long enough, what'll happen is if it's like really wet and you have that flaking, sometimes if you pull the flaking, like some of this flaking might stick to this area, and then if you push it down onto your item, all of a sudden you get that flaking stuck to your item. So kind of make sure you pull with your item. See, like this, get a little bit of flaking or something there. You could kind of rub that off with some saliva, fingernail, and it comes out. I'll have to get in there a little bit. That might be from something else. So you just kind of, so you can see maybe there's like a little bit of a flaking piece right here. You kind of scrape that off. And it comes right out. So I'm just going to go along the line and do all this, taking this off, and then we'll see how it looks. Okay, so before I actually do the red here, I was just doing a little bit of testing and I mold this over. So usually when I paint, sometimes things just evolve and change. So what I'm doing is going to bring out these details a little bit more in her dress. So basically all you need is some, like, you know, gunmetal or some kind of, you know, metallic paint. And you can just kind of go in like this. And because it's such a car paint, you just wipe your finger and just take it right off, like so. And then you can, basically, it's like washing into the center of it. So you kind of bring out the area. I tried a little bit with red. I didn't like the way the red was kind of popping out too much. So I think I'm just going to go in there with some of the silver and just kind of make this pop a little bit more. I might do some of it down here. So this way when I start doing this red trim and then I do the silver here, it'll kind of blend together, which should look pretty good. Okay, so I masked her off again, which is took another like 20 minutes or so. Basically, I masked off the top of her outfit. And as you can see over here, there is saran wrap. But what I did is I used that foam sheets that I have, because I didn't want any of the saran wrap actually touching that car paint clear, because it's very hot today and very humid. So if I do put that on there and I leave it too long, I'll get scared that maybe I pull some of that paint off. And so it gets very sticky, so I got to be careful. So this foam stuff is going to protect it for now. And the only saran wrap that's hitting it is pretty much the Silly Putty over here. It's not hitting anything else. So as far as the paint up, what we're going to do is kind of like a dark leather. So I got over here basically some P3 red, which will go on very thick. It's a very good paint to get on there very thick that covers everything evenly. And then I have some mahogany, and then I have some true red where I might do some highlights and some shades and kind of mix them. So I have to kind of think about how I'm going to do the rest of the outfit after I do the top. I might do the trim. I might do like the leather trim coming down in like a stripe coming down. Or maybe what I'll do is I'll do just a little bit of that texture or that stylized etching that Roberto did. Maybe I'll do some of that dark red into there. I don't know. I got to toy with it. Right now it's better to get the top done, add the arms to her, then I can get a feel of where I'm at with the whole outfit. And it's kind of helped me like doing a lot more of the detailing work. Alright, so I painted it up. It's got a satin varnish on top of it, so it looks a little shiny, but it still feels a little bit leathery looking. I didn't want it flat. I want a little bit of like, you know, maybe like a buffed out leather type stuff, like a leather jacket, stuff like that. So what I'm going to do now is pull off the masking, so give you guys an idea on how masking comes off when you do this. So this works out easier when... And then this comes around here, so you don't have to worry about messing that up at all. Now, as far as this, it's sort of still a little wet, but it's not like, you know, completely cured up. I did hit it with the blow dryer, so it should come out pretty fine. So you just take your time, and this sort of separates no problem. So you can see a big difference of separation compared to everything else. So if you have any little bleeding, which sometimes I do, only because I think the one paint I used was a little watery. If you work fast enough, you can grab your tool and you can get in here and you can kind of take it out. So that's why I paint up the skin like I do, because I know the paints can sort of come up and take them out and take that little mess up out of there. So I got a little spot over here and one over here. That's the only problem with certain paints. If you over thin them down, they can cause a little bit issues, like so. So I'm not too fan of super watery paints. I try to make them as thick as I can and still go through the airbrush. It just takes a little time to take it out. It cleans up pretty well. So let's pull off this area here. Now Silly Putty will pull certain things, so you got to be careful. Like if you did Archer Fine Transfer Detail eyes or something up there and you did all that, it might pull off the decal. So like I said, I save those for the end. Now if you have any Silly Putty stuck there, instead of trying to get out, you know, instead of trying to get in there and pull that out, what you do is you could use Silly Putty to sort of pull Silly Putty out, and it comes right out. So that's the top of the dress so far. I'm liking the way it's looking. So like I said, what's going to happen is I'm going to let this cure up a bit. I'm going to kind of maybe toy with some of this. I thought about maybe bringing the line of dress around, but maybe what I'll do is, instead of doing a thicker stuff, I'll maybe use a thin paint line and come down with this very thin edge and do like a really like red edge going around the whole piece, just like really thin, just to give it a little bit of a line work. And I think once I start adding the jewelry, I think it should start coming together. So I'm not sure if I want to do this piece here in red, which I might. Maybe I'll do a thin line here, and then I'll do this thicker piece over here in the red that I did up here. So yeah, we're getting there slowly. Okay, so what I did is off camera, just took my time and pretty much just added like metallic paint into all those details on the dress, as you can see. It's just a matter of taking a fine paintbrush, putting it in the areas, wiping it off with my finger, and just kind of bringing out those details a little bit more. So I think it makes the dress pop a lot more now. You can see those details. So like I say, everything always evolves when I paint. Sometimes I'm like, nah, I'm not going to do that, but then as I do it, I'm like, okay, now we're going to change it up and go that route. That's kind of where we're at with it. The front of it, I didn't want too potent, but it is there, so you can kind of see. It's kind of more of like a grayish in the front of the dress. But I also did some of the black line work too on the red trim over there. Just kind of did some washing in there to bring out those areas, but it came out okay. So what I'm going to do now is sort of add some heat to the bottom of the dress in the back. I'm not going to go too crazy. I figured what I'll do is I'll do some transparency yellow, just a little bit around the area. See how that looks, and then I'm definitely going to put red around it. So I want this sort of like, it's a latex dress, it's kind of, you know, going down, but as it hit in the lava, it's getting warmer at the bottom because she's a fire elemental, and plus her feet are going to be kind of blending into the base too, so it's kind of like the same thing. So I'll see how I can go far I could go at the bottom of the dress. Things always evolve as I work on items. I have a vision on it, but then when I start painting and I add color, things change, and I kind of go different routes and add different things. So I think that'll add a little bit more to it once it's done. And then after that, we'll focus on the rest of her.